My humble greetings. Now we'll talk about the city of Soest, which is located almost in the heart of North Rhine-Westphalia in Germany. This city is overshadowed by different, much more popular tourist cities in this region like Düsseldorf, Aachen, Köln, Münster, and you can continue this list. I've visited maybe 30 or even 40 cities in this region, and I never heard of this city before. Where I found out about it was on some kind of German newspaper. Then I thought maybe I should choose this if I will run out of options. But that was a great mistake, because the city of Soest has lots of preserved old churches and how-timbered houses. It has almost 600 how-timbered houses under the Denkmalschutz. Denkmalschutz is a law in Germany that forces owners of those old houses to always renovate them and keep them in good conditions. And when I came to this city, I was really surprised by the atmosphere, by the true medieval atmosphere in here. And today we'll talk about this. I will show you places you must visit in the city center, and I will tell you a bit of a history of those places, and hopefully that will convince you to give it a try. So this church doesn't look that special from the outside. It was built in 1220, and the most interesting stuff is inside. And I'm talking about ceiling and wall paintings. On the choir part, you may see some Byzantium influence that is really unique for Germany because they don't have much of this architectural approach. They have one cathedral in Aachen, which is really popular because of its difference from all others, and it also has Byzantium influence. So this church in this city is not only unique for this place, but unique for most of the Germany. This cross is also really interesting because that is the only one that type of cross on the Europe's mainland. They have something similar on the island of Gotland in Sweden, but here in the Europe's mainland, that's the only one. How church was built is also unusual because you'll hardly find here any symmetry. It is wider than it's long. Among all those things, this church is just beautiful. The feeling inside is something special. I was in many churches in Germany, but that one feels a bit different because of abundance of those wall paintings. So I will definitely recommend to visit this city only because of this church. So this city had 10 gates which were leading into the city, and we have only one of them actually preserved from that time. That is called Osthofentor. It was built between 1523 and 1526. It was done by Master Propius, and remember that name, we'll come back to this. Visible from the outside are the outward-facing bays. In German they call it Erker. They were used for defense as well as the chimney. The gate opening was originally triple secured by two gate wings. Inside there is a museum of town's history, and actually they have some unique thing about it. They have a collection of 24,000 medieval crossbow bolts. I never saw something like this in any museum, but that is something nice to write on some kind of news page or on Wikipedia. I actually like the design, it looks convincing, which was the real thing to scare the invaders or to convince those traders, those merchants who came into the city that they will be safe during their business. We're now on the Wallmauer. That is the only walkable and tree-lined city wall in Europe, except of city of Lucca in Tuscany. So those are only two cities who had those characteristics. It was built in 12th century to defend the city and was reconstructed multiple times because of the change of defense technology. It went useless during the 30 Years' War due to complete changes in war technology. It was no more suitable for defending. So now they had to find some other approach how to use this wall practically. So in 18th century they wanted to repurpose this complex. So they planted mulberry trees along the wall for the production of silk, but that was not really successful. Anyways, that is a really good place for melancholic walk, and all this real medieval city wall is a reminder of that time. The next church we want to talk about, called the Leaning Tower among the Fox, it was built in 1270, and that makes it one of the oldest Gothic church buildings in the city. But the characteristical tower only dates back to 1653. There are some theories why this tower is curved. The first one is that was done so to provide less surface area for the harsh westerly wind. The second one is more realistic and really popular in Germany. The materials were not really great, and with the time the tower started to lean due to rot in the beams. Corresponding investigations prove the second theory, so we can consider that's the right reason. A little sister to Old St. Thomas is New St. Thomas, which is a former monastery of the Franciscans. It was built in 1233, and that is actually the first monastery in Westphalia founded by Franciscans. Unfortunately, the church fell victim during the Second World War, and the only things survived is the choir and the outer walls of the nave. That's unfortunate, but the church was rebuilt in its old form, so now it looks kind of the same it was. But monastery buildings are not really there now. On the other hand, normal people never tell the difference between the old and renovated one. This church still has its atmosphere, and that's the most valuable thing about it. if you're paying attention, you may ask why this city, which has lots of churches and how-timbered houses, was probably rich back then, but is not rich now anymore. And that's the good question. Back then, this city was a part of Hansa Union, which was first ever trading union between North German cities. And this city was specializing on selling salt. The salt was incredibly important in Northern Europe. That was a value of silver in those times. So by selling that kind of stuff, you would of course get rich, and many people who built their business on that kind of trade had houses in this city and sponsored churches in this city. That's why in Middle Ages this town was important. But the question now is, why isn't it that important now? The problem is that Soest almost wasn't influenced by Industrial Revolution. So when in rural region cities developed their wealth and became richer, Soest went not really that important. That's why it lost its value. But actually that thing saved the city during World War II. Because it was not that important, Allies didn't bomb this much during World War II. And all those how-timbered houses were preserved, not in perfect conditions, but in some condition here. On the other hand, no one really knows nowadays about this city. That is not such a popular tourist attraction. But when you find it, you'll be satisfied and surprised with its beauty, with its history, as I was when I came here. So like I already said, in 12th century the city wall was built, then it was reconstructed, and in 13th century they added somewhere 36 defense towers. It stands from 1230, and that is the only one originally preserved city tower. Cotton Tomb sounds like it has something to do with cats, and that's not entirely true. So in the past, the fortifications were mainly attacked with catapults, storm ladders, and so-called cotton. They were concealed positional carriages under cover of which attackers could get close to the walls and gates. The tower has probably owed its name to these since at least 1627. Honestly, it's not nicer than the city gate. On the other hand, it's nice to know that that tower was built in 13th century and it actually survived these times and it still stands here. Found your friend? Oh, big one. This church is called Paulikirche. It was built in the middle of 14th century in Romanesque and Gothic style. It has an altar from school of Konrad von Soest. I think we heard of him before. Inside or outside, this church looks great, but unfortunately during World War II all those old windows were destroyed because of the bombs. But the church mainly remains from Middle Ages time. It is a bit cold in there, maybe that's the coldest church I ever visited, but the atmosphere is warm and that is maybe the most important part. That is the Teichmühle from the 13th century, so that is pretty old. And the pond, called the Great Pond, is really beautiful at night when lights reflect from the surface of the water. But the most interesting thing is on the other side of the pond. That is a replica of the Wippe. The Wippe is a medieval instrument of punishment painted in the disgraceful color yellow. Until the end of the 18th century, the seesaw was used in zoos to punish people. But according to reports, no one was physically harmed during this disgraceful punishment. Of course, no one uses this as a punishment now. It is used for performances, for festivals, and some kind of that stuff, which is pretty lovely. This great pond in the middle provides here a nice atmosphere that is not something you would commonly see in the middle of German Alttown. Maybe the most visible and admirable church is St. Maria zur Wiese. We already had one called St. Maria zur Höhe at the beginning, but that is a different one. The foundation stone for the current building was laid in 1330. Prior to this, a Romanesque predecessor building stood on this site at the end of the 12th century, which was initially called Maria in Palut, which means Mary in the Swamp. At this time there was still a spring swamp here. Master Porphyrius, that I told you to remember from the city gate, initially completed the late Gothic building in 1529. However, the towers were only erected subsequently between 1846 and 1876, and the entire building was only completed in 1882. Unfortunately, the typical Zoes green sandstone used for the construction proved to be unsuitable and too susceptible to weathering. A whole renovation of the tower began in 1997 and it goes still since then. In addition to important panel paintings from the 14th and 16th century, there is a window called Westphalian Last Supper above the north portal. It was created around 16th century by an unknown artist and shows Jesus at the Last Supper with his followers. However, instead of wine and bread, there is ham and beer, which I guess is a better way to make the story closer to simple folks which visit the church. The house Kugelhaus was a part of a former 17th and 18th century manor house. Parts of the farmstead that have been preserved to this day are the residential building, stables, barn and a tea house. The park in the area has its name after the merchant Konstantin Wilhelm Bergnaltal. I hope I spelled that right. And then, when he acquired the estate, his name went to this park. In the middle of 20th century, the barn went to an artist, educator, and carpenter, Hugo Kugelhaus. And that is really a nice choice for an artist to create and rest in such a nice atmosphere, I guess. Okay, the next Capella, I don't really know what to tell about this, except that it's really old. It was built in 1225, not built, first mentioned. It houses the oldest pulpit in Zeus, dating from 1553, and for a long time it served as a studio of the Zeus artist Fritz Risken, but today it's privately owned, so I was not able to get inside. I made some photos though about the star, what you can hopefully see in this capella. It looks great on the outside though, and around it it has lots of Hautenbert houses, so I think it was visiting. This city actually dates to the Neolithic period, and it had signs of human settlement all the way from that time. But you may ask, why did they choose exactly this place? Those is not an exception. Actually, they have chain of settlements in this area, like Dortmund, for example. Why they settled here is an interesting question, because of numerous springs where they get salt later, and because of one very old trade road. This trade road is called Hellweg. That is a trading road between Rhine and Elbe, two main and very rich rivers in Germany. Since Soest was kind of in the middle between those two rivers, it was a great point to exchange goods and take something and then go west or east. We have already talked about salt production in this area, which made this city rich. They started this salt production around 500 after the Christ birth. The brine springs in the neighborhood meant that salt production became an important medieval industry in the city at an early stage. But how old is the actual city? In Middle Ages, they considered a settlement a city when it had city walls and was well presented in terms of trading. Zeus was first mentioned in a document in 836 as Villa Zosatz on the occasion of the transfer of the bones of Saint Vitus from Saint Denis near France to the city of Corvey. It doesn't mean that the city was built in 836, it just means that there was some settlement in the area. I've already told you about the walls, but there is some additional information to this. The city had a walled area of 102 hectares and was thus one of the largest medieval city complexes in present-day Germany. The 3.8 kilometers long city wall was protected by 26 towers and had 10 city gates, which we already know. But here comes the moment where the city went even more important, and that was maybe the first step for this city to join Hansa Union. That was when German King William of Holland gave special protection by the empire as early as 2052 and granted the city extensive trading privileges, which made this city even more possibilities to grow its wealth. Then those became one of the most important cities in Hansa Union. That was even more important than the city of Novgorod in modern Russia. But something went wrong. We have recordings that the last time those was represented at a general Hanseatic Day in Lübeck was in 1608. Those did not take part in the last Hanseatic Day in 1669. There are multiple reasons for that. Of course, the 30 Years' War was a great problem for many cities, not only this region, but all across the Germany. But even before this, in the late Middle Ages, those tried to get its independence, as many cities at this time. They wanted to get independence from the regional rulers. In this case, that was Archbishop of Köln, which ruled over the Duchy of Westphalia. He had a great power here, and getting independence may seem a great thing for this city. In order to preserve or expand its independence, in the 15th century, the town placed itself under the protection of John I, Duke of Cleves, who was a relative of the Burgundian ruling house and granting those a large degree of independence. The victory over the archbishop was, however, a Pyrrhic victory, because Zoes was now surrounded by many foreign territories from all sides, which prevented good trading. The trading tower subsequently lost power and influence and became more and more of an agricultural town. Then came a 30 Years' War, which caused lots of devastations in here. But at the beginning of the 19th century, it seems like the city went well, with around 5,000 to 8,000 inhabitants, was one of the largest cities in Westphalia after Münster, Paderborn, Iserlohn and Minden. However, like I said, due to the industrialization in the rural area, Soest was overtaken in the middle of the 19th century and missed out on economic integration. Even railway didn't help. The city was bombed by the Allies, but not that heavily as many much more important industrial cities. I already talked about this. After they completed two connections to the Autobahn number 44 in 1970 and the establishment of the university, this city got a chance to become an economically prosperous city and place of residence for many workers from the western rural area. Now we have one of the few representative Baroque buildings that was built from 1730 to 1760, and that is actually the town hall. It has its own nine-arched hall on the west side. The patron saint of the town, Saint Patroclus, is enthroned above the archway. At the rear of the Baroque building is the newer part of the town hall, which once also housed a grammar school where Konrad Duden taught. If you go in the library, you will most likely find a book of German grammar, and there will be this name, Konrad Duden. So he is the father on German spelling. Now it's just a nice thing to see. Unfortunately, or fortunately, we have a Christmas market here, so you cannot really see all the stuff going on in terms of architecture, but I think it's good because we have a nice atmosphere here. That is the Nikolaus-Kapelle from 12th century. It is dedicated to the patron saint of sailors and travelers. Inside there is a precious altar piece from the school of the master Konrad von Soest. He's not really famous in Germany or in this region, but in city of Soest he is a person people are paying respect to. So now about St. Patrokli. That is a church visible from any area in this city. The Romanesque building was built after 965 after bones of St. Patroclus were transferred to Soest. An important treasure is Tree of Jesus window in the West Walk, which shows a depiction of the lineage of Jesus. Also was seen is the apes painting from 1200 in the Marine Choir. St. Patrokli is still considered the most extensive complex of its kind in Westphalia. The West Walk is 77 meters high and housed the city's armory in the Middle Ages. This church had those 25,000 crossbow bolts we talked about when we were in the Osthofentor. When I was in this church, there was a Christmas market and this little Christmas installation inside the church. Next to St. Patrokli we have St. Petri with this wonderful tower. It was built in 1174 and now people think that that is the oldest church in Westphalia. But actually the oldest part of this church is from 8th century. We have the choir from 1277 in Gothic style. This great tower was rebuilt in Baroque style though. This church doesn't have this abundance of wall paintings as in our first church, though that is also really interesting to visit, and that is built differently compared to San Maria zur Höhe. During World War II, the choir, the Gothic choir, was destroyed. That's why it was renovated from some older photos of this altar place. If you will ever be between Dortmund and Paderborn, maybe in the area of Kassel, Düsseldorf, or in Westphalia overall, that'll be great to visit this city. It has its own atmosphere. It is now so loud and crowded as cities near Düsseldorf. Soest is perfect for walking through those narrow lanes. You don't have to visit all those places I told you about. Soest has lots of museums, also some interesting festivals, and just the whole picture of the city is nice. I'm glad I found out about this city and finally visited it. Thank you for your time, and I hope that Soest was a great journey for you as it was for me. See ya!